Shakespeare's Sonnet 29. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my outcast state, wishing myself like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least. Yet in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate, for thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. All right. Now, in this poem, we have a series of contrasts, and as in most of Shakespeare's poems, the rhyming couplet at the end pretty much sums up the poem, and in many ways contradicts what goes before with a concluding argument. So the argument in the first part is about his state of mind, and it's based on what society, in his mind now, what society demands of people. All right, so he sees himself in that relationship. So it's like a state of life that he's created, and he doesn't measure up in his mind to what he thinks society demands of others, or all right. Now, a couple of words in here. Bootless. All right. If you read Julius Caesar, you probably remember Caesar saying to Brutus, "Does Brutus bootless kneel?" In other words, in vain. There's no. You're wasting your time. It's futile. In other words, it's not going to bring about any result. So that's what he's talking about there. Bootless cries to heaven because they're unanswered, they're unheeded. All right. What other word in here? Let's see here. Right. So that would be probably the only word that would create a problem. So he tells us that in the beginning, he considers himself low on the status pole of what society thinks of people, all right? And for that reason, he is on the verge of despair, all right? So we'll read through it again with that in mind. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, when I feel like I'm in disgrace in their eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state. Okay, so that speaks for itself. And I trouble deaf heaven, there's no answer, all right, with my bootless cries that, again, they're in vain. And I look upon myself and I curse the state that I'm in. I'm an outcast from the rest of people. Wishing, now these are some of the things he desires, to be like one more rich in hope, in aspirations, and in moving up the social ladder. All right, wishing myself like one more rich in hope. But I don't have that, okay? I lack that. Featured like him with friends possessed, like he would like to be surrounded by his friends, all right? But he feels he does not have that. And he desires art and science and knowledge, man's scope, intelligence. With what I most enjoy, I am contented least. So you see the opposites of these superlatives: most enjoy, least contented. All right, and yet in these thoughts, here's the change in the poem. Okay, the turn, a volta, when the action takes a new direction, and he says, "Yet in these thoughts, myself almost on the verge of despair, despising myself, Haply I think on thee, his beloved. And then my state, and then beautiful image here of a lark at break of day, arising from sullen earth. There's the opposites again, sullen earth, and to the high heavens, heaven's gate. Okay, so the lark in the morning rises off the ground, flies heavenward, and you can feel the uplifting of the spirit from sullen earth that goes to heaven's gate. He sings hymns at heaven's gate. And for thy sweet love, remembered, when I think on you, okay, my thoughts are on you, such wealth brings that then I would rather be who I am than be a king, okay? I scorn to change my, he poo-poos that. I don't want any part of being a king, a state of king. So, that's the highest. Again, the pinnacle, we have the extremes, highest to lowest, from sullen earth to being a king, the top of the totem pole. So that's what this poem is filled with, opposites. And in the analysis that I do here, I bring that out. The sonnet begins by presenting two opposite states of reality. Envy for the status of being in a higher place in society, a place of respectability, and he feels that he lacks that. And the reality of his relationship with his beloved, when he comes to that in line 9, which is usually where that happens in a sonnet, okay? The octave sets up one idea, and then the sestet, 14 lines, changes the direction. So he says, happily when I think on thee, everything changes. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about, the reality of his relationship. Regarding the first, that is, his state of being in a feeling of dejection and despair, he almost despairs when he considers his present status, and he offers instances to cause him to hold this view, saying that he feels fate has jinxed him. I curse my fate. And he wishes he had steadfast friends, as others do. And he desires to have gifts of artistic ability, this man's art and that man's scope, and a higher level of intelligence, scope. So all of these things are based on his view of what, social status should be like. And for this reason, he considers himself entirely worthless. Here's the key: in the eyes of others, not himself. Okay? He's projecting himself into the minds of those in society and what he thinks they think of him. Problem here is that his conception of his own self is based on what he thinks society dictates life ought to be. Okay? And that's not always true. The sonnet is constructed around all these opposites, each line conveying opposites of superlative adjectives. When I say superlative, I mean like the third, like good, better is comparative, and then superlative is the best. So he uses these superlatives such as most. What I most enjoy, I am contented with least, little, less, least. That's the superlative. Little, I have little contentment. No. I have less contentment. No. I have the least contentment. All right? And then we have the contrast between sullen earth and deaf heaven. The lark arising to heaven's gate. And then the next one, the first part, the octave, he says, my bootless cries to deaf heaven, doesn't answer my cry. And then heaven's gate is the opposite again. So the turn, or the volta, occurs in line 9 when he says, happily I think on thee, and then my state sings hymns at heaven's gate. So he's aspired to that high height, all right? When, his thoughts of her lift his spirits. This line is self-analytic moment in the poem because he suddenly comes to realize that he does have something he desires most, unlike what he said before, where he said earlier he cries to deaf heaven. They were unheard and unheeded. He suddenly comes to realize that he does, in fact, enjoy something that is the most, and that changes everything. As in all of Shakespeare's sonnets, the closing two lines, the couplet, rhyming couplet at the end, reconciles the opposition discussed in the body of the poem. It's an open repudiation of his former thoughts, discarding his belief that what society thinks of him is important. In fact, it's impertinent, it doesn't count at all. For thy sweet love remembered, such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state, even with kings. So that's analysis. Now let's read it again. When in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my outcast state, wishing myself like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least. All right, so there's the octave, sestet. Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state like to the lark at break of day, arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered, such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. All right, so the octave, and it also, notice the internal rhyme, the alliteration, the rhyming scheme, I state, cries, state, hope, zest, scope, lest, least in that case, despising, state, arising, gate, and then the rhyming couplet at the end. That's the difference between a Petrarchan sonnet and a Shakespearean sonnet, or the Petrarchan sonnet would be A, B, B, A. In other words, this line would line with that, and these two would, but this is a Shakespearean sonnet. However, the octave and the sestet do the same job, okay, and they're written in iambic pentameter, 5 beats per line. When in disgrace with fortune men's eyes, 5 beats. All right, so that's the end of the analysis.